pleasure to welcome our keynote panel. This is Will Roberts and Attila Fulecki, who will be sharing with us their perspectives on opportunities for growth in the EV vertical. All right, so let's dive in. So first, a very quick introduction. Will Roberts is the automotive research lead at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, and Attila Fulecki is the director of strategic projects at Volvo Cars. Will, it's great to have you here.
Hi, thanks, Michael. Great to be here.
Perfect. And Attila, it's also great to have you here too.
Likewise, happy to be here for the first time, but it seems like a good venue for sure.
Fantastic. All right, we're going to start off with some high-level questions, and then we'll go into some specifics. So, Will, I'd love for you to kick us off. We had put together this panel because, especially in the US, we're in somewhat of an EV winter where EV deployment and growth is pretty stagnant. But if we separate the EV market by region, vehicle segment, and buyer type, where do you see the strongest evidence of durable growth over the next 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, a good question. I think when it comes to durable growth, the EV market has been really volatile over the last, pick a number, however many years, by region, by vehicle segment, by customer type. Everybody's kind of had their ups and downs in particular. When I think about kind of where starting to come out as a strong contender over the next couple of years, my immediate reaction does at the moment go to the European region. I think partly because it's standing out to me because it's quietly shifting into a new gear. And I think I say quietly because there is still noisy pushback, insistent that, sometimes it's failing or sometimes it sounds like it's falling or maybe just not growing as fast as everybody thinks it is outside the battery industry. But the reality is that there is some really strong continued progression there. We've seen kind of a renewal of subsidies across really major markets. There's still a very strong progressive legislative base towards that market. And that all creates quite a solid foundation. We saw things, they went negative for a little bit in 2024. That came back with a vengeance in 2025. And so far, the early signals this year have been a really strong continuation of that momentum through 2026. All the individual markets within Europe are starting to find their feet with the nuance of policy as well. It's really important that legislators do get down to that nuance because tiny changes can start to have quite expansive impacts, and especially with the complication of policy as we move forward as well. But I think this does apply across the other portions of your question as well. So like vehicle segment, buyer type, also true in Europe. There's this flurry of kind of new products coming through, particularly in the small segments, the more affordable vehicle segments, that is going to open up new buyer types that have basically been excluded from the transition up to now. So far, what we've seen from some of those products, they have had really immediate appeal to a lot of people as well. So I think there's a lot to be kind of positive there. In a time where sometimes it feels like there's overwhelming waves of negativity. Sometimes things happening in the US get lumped in with things happening in Europe as if it's all a homogenous block. But we've definitely seen a divergence of regions over the past few years as well.
Yes, absolutely. If I recall the numbers from last year, the US had about 10% deployment of EVs in all cars sold last year, and for the EU market, it was a 30% year-on-year growth, and that was without the battery booster program and other things that are happening this year. And
yeah.
I don't know if you have put some analysis into this, but for your forecast for 2026, do you expect this to be a similar growth pace, or would it be accelerated or slowed down in the European market?
We actually initially expected that 2026 might see a bit of a dip because last year we had emissions legislation that really OEMs had to get a head start of for 2025. So that made sense that really pushed a lot of growth, especially off a lower 2024. And then that got extended over a 3-year period, which meant that actually the crunch year is now not last year and it's not this year, it becomes 2027. When that's happened in the past, sometimes there's a bit of a relaxation in 2020 in the middle year, which would be this year, and then a really strong push next year. But to see that momentum carry through quite significantly so far this at the start of this year has been a very positive signal with respect to all of that as well. So so far it's operating towards the high end of our kind of range between base case and upside scenario in the 20% now as well. So if we can push forward and see similar growth to last year off what was a similar or a positive year, then that will be a very strong signal for the European market. Like you said, came out last year as the fastest growing major region, so outpacing China, which slowed throughout the year, and then of course the US ended up about flat.
Yes, absolutely. I have a question that I'd love to ask both you, Will, and Attila. And Attila, maybe we can start with you first, as we'll want to introduce this topic. So from your perspective, what has changed the most since this first wave of EV adoption that we had earlier in the 2020s? The consumer, the vehicle technology, the policy environment, or the supply chain?
Should I go, or
Please,
I could
yes.
say, yeah. I think to some extent I would say the supply chain. I mean, if we look at how battery costs have declined over the past 10, 15 years, it's just tremendous, and which is the true enabler for EV adoption, I think, as they are such a big portion. I mean, battery costs is the key to cost parity between BEVs and ICE vehicles. So I really think that China, I mean, we might like it or not, but China has done a great job in building a supply chain that is really taking care of all the leftover pieces from the various processing steps. So I think it's been developed into a very efficient supply chain, where some actors like to integrate more vertically, but also actors that don't have good products and good prospects. So I think, from my point of view, I think the supply chain has been the biggest enabler for EV growth in general, due to pricing.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And especially from your seat at the table, you probably feel the most direct effects of that supply chain build out and those price pressures.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, it's very much linked to pricing. So and there's only so many customers who have 100,000 euros to spend or $100,000 to spend on a vehicle. So it definitely needs to come down. So it's we are interlinked in the industry due to this. So we all depend on this, I would say.
Absolutely. And Will, what about yourself? What do you think what has changed the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think if Attila's not gonna do it himself, then I would like to give some credit to the vehicle side of things as well. I think for an industry, it's an incredible upheaval that is hard to find parallels for elsewhere in the world. Having a wholesale removal of kind of an industry's core technology, I think is often underappreciated to some respects as well. And then to see kind of the distance that EVs have come just in the short period since 2015, 16, 17 even, they're broadly unrecognizable, versus a few years ago, as testament to the kind of pace of change that a lot of OEMs have put into to developing vehicle technology as well around EV powertrains. Sometimes that causes itself its own issues. I think we've seen that on depreciation, secondhand values in particular. Why consumers are often incentivized basically to wait for the next release. There's always a more exciting EV around the corner. I found this with myself as well, often thinking, oh, what EV would I buy if I was going to buy today? And the answer is usually the one that I know is being released in like 3, 4, 6 months time. And I'm sure that's prevalent across kind of all consumers as well. But yeah, I think across like the potential things that have changed the most that you highlighted, whether it's consumers or vehicle tech or policy or supply chain, the fact that there's so much revolution happening in all of those areas at different times and sometimes at different paces does mean that they're rarely precisely in sync with one another, and that can definitely cause the turbulence that we're talking about earlier as well. So it's sort of all happening, but yeah, supply chain for sure. But I'll definitely give some credit to the OEMs too.
No, I love that. And yeah, I think many people in this audience will also maybe feel the same way of if you're in the industry and you know what's coming in terms of the technology pipeline, you're just like, oh, I want to wait for this technology to be deployed and then I'll buy an EV. But it's always the next thing that is in the pipeline that you want to see in your car.
Indeed. Absolutely.
Yes, yes, yes. We're going to move into some more specific questions about the industry. And Will, I'll look to you first again. So I'm going to apply a little bit of a reductionist view of the different regions in China and Europe and the US, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this too. So we're seeing a little bit different activities in these three regions, and which market is teaching the most important lesson for the industry? Is it China with on scale and speed and deployment? Europe on policy and affordability, or the US on really finding the best product market fit? And please correct these reductionist views of these regions. If you have different opinions, I'd just love to hear what you think about this.
Yeah, I guess in terms of your reductionist characterizations, one thing that I would immediately think about is the Europe on affordability is something that I think it needs to solve critically. But from where we sit, I think it's very much unsolved at the moment. Progress is definitely being made. I talked about the models coming, new segments, etc. But one of the things that we track quite closely here as well is like a price tracker, but based on what people are actually buying. So looking at the most popular vehicles and weighting it around that as well. And one thing that always astounds me is just how cheap that comes out when you look at the ICE market in Europe for what's available base price in Europe. People do still love small cars here, and the price that those small cars can be achieved at in the ICE market is still very much out of reach for the battery electric vehicle market. So there's still some way to go, definitely, on actually affordability for those very base level models. You can definitely find kind of comparables across a lot of market segments where there is a good BEV that makes the that stacks up well against a nice vehicle. But yeah, there's still a bit to go there. In terms of lessons though, and teaching lessons, I think all three regions have and are still teaching each other lessons. And I think it's also important to, depending which region you're kind of sat in respectively, to either not think that you're so far behind or so disillusioned to progress that you have to learn exclusively the lessons of another region, or also to think that you're so far ahead that you don't have any lessons to learn from another region as well. But also to keep in mind what is unique about a market that you do operate in, and to not kind of overlearn, I guess, some lessons. So like on speed and scale in China, I mean, we're obviously seeing European OEMs take a lot of lessons and a lot of learnings on that front, particularly operating in the Chinese market. That's a big shift. You can't turn up with the same business model and the same product that you had in Europe and make it work in China to the same extent anymore. It's got its own demographic. It's got its own wants and needs from vehicles, internally, technology-wise, performance-wise. And those lessons do need to be learned. And things come to market very quickly there. And that's something that European OEMs are obviously kind of taking on board now quite rapidly. Simultaneously, though, we still see China learning lessons from legacy European market too. How China has operated in the BEV market over the last 5 or 6 years that's brought some of that pace and made everybody so aware of scale and speed is that to come to market, you bring you bring new models all the time, basically. To some extent, that's not completely sustainable forevermore. You can't always just launch a new model when you need to kind of expand into a segment or grow a customer base. Sooner or later, you have to start learning the kind of product life cycle and replacement cycle that is more prevalent in the automotive industry in Europe and North America, for example. And I think we're starting to see that now. We're seeing less new model launches of brand new names, and we're starting to see replacement come through from what was an original launch 3, 4, 5 years ago. And that's something that can be learned from Europe and North America, where that craft has been honed over hundreds of years, quite literally. And we still see a lot of talent transfer at the top end in design and technology and platforms to Chinese OEMs looking to expand as well. So definitely there's a two-way street in terms of learnings between those two. And not to leave out the US as well. I think Europe is still learning on policy and domestic protection in particular. What's coming down the pipeline seems to look a little bit like what happened under the IRA as well. I think Europe still has not quite learned the funding gap issue that we have never quite had that as it's been a bit of a missing piece in Europe. Something that they could learn from both China and the US, whether that's over a long period or a short period. So yeah, there's a lot of policy, there's a lot of lesson learning, I think, going in all directions. But yeah, starting to settle down and realize what lessons you need to learn and stick to in your region. That's the fundamental for me.
Absolutely. Attila, we'll just describe the whole lot of nuance and complexity in each of these markets. And, as an automaker, this is probably a huge headache for you to address all of the three markets. This is a side question. I'm kind of curious, how realistic is it to standardize EV platforms across all these regions? Is it even feasible?
Good question. I think on the software side, I would say it's I wouldn't recommend it, considering how the regulators are tightening what type of software can be used in what region. So I think from the software side, each region will have to sort of create their own solutions, more or less. Maybe Europe and US could share, but that still remains to be revealed. But for definitely, I think China is Chinese products for the Chinese or that market, and European products for European, and maybe some cross shipping between the Europe and US from that sense. But yes, I mean, what you're touching upon is especially for EVs and a lot of if you talk about battery cells or whatnot, we've seen a history of very rapid change, which means that everybody's been changing cells every second years, more or less. So, if you look at BMW or us, Volvo Cars or someone else, there's always new formats, new chemistries, there's always something new. And with that, you don't really build a base for a long-term cost-efficient structure. So, and then of course you need to keep in mind that in the Western world, at least, our product cycles are longer, so we need to maintain these products for spare parts and whatnot. So it really complicates the whole deal of that. So for us, I think for the industry, for Europe, maybe also definitely also for US, I think standardization and some type of coming together around certain formats or certain platforms, trying to do that could be an enabler, especially when setting up a new industry, because that's so painful. It's so capital intense to build EV value chains for cells, for everything. So if we don't standardize, if we don't try to utilize these assets to a high degree, I think we will be facing very much what we've seen so far: bankruptcies and companies struggling to really survive. So yeah, I think there's definitely potential there. The problem has always been, whose idea or whose solution should win. But I think for the battery area, we do see some tendency for harmonization around the 46, whatever that might be, cells. That could be one way to do it. We know that more and more players are interested in that. We are also looking. Every player is looking, of course, how to overcome and how to simplify the future, because we can't keep changing one of the most expensive components as we have done historically. And for a battery manufacturer, I mean, they are so dependent on having a customer order, and and right now a lot of these lines are being built uniquely for a customer product. So as that customer's demand varies, then you have spare capacity or underutilized machining. So it's not really ideal from a utilization perspective of these high, very expensive assets. Yeah.
No, I love that you brought up the point of utilization ratio and factory utilization. One of the large key metrics that are distinguishing BYD CATL from the rest of the cell makers is really their utilization ratio. And that affects their bottom line and profitability. And would consider that BYD and CATL have a very strong platform of standardized products that they're able to offer and sell, whereas they can minimize those stranded assets. So I love that you brought that up. I wanted to also cover one other thing that Will also mentioned. So Will mentioned the onshoring lesson that Europe is learning from the US. Until if European cells can meaningfully be more expensive than imported cells, uh, what is the argument for onshoring? What is the strongest argument for doing this? If cost is one of the key antagonist factors.
I think the main reason why companies will be doing it is first and foremost, I think, regulation and subsidies. They have such a huge influence on consumer choice and affordability, because EVs, we have to keep in mind, EVs are still a bit more expensive in the Western world, at least. In China, they are not, but in China, the OEMs also struggle with profitability. So we must keep that in mind. So, so yeah, I think regulation and legislation, subsidies, they go in hand. So I think this is one of the key drivers. Yes, we also look at resilience, and many companies do, and many regions do. We want to have resilient supply chains. I think the challenge is to achieve that is such a long process, and it's not enough to just make a cell manufacturing in if you talk about Europe, or you need to have the full supply chain, because otherwise you're still stranded with your cell manufacturing line if you can't get hold of the various materials that you need, processed materials. And then the question is, where is that processing going to happen? So it's yeah, it can be done. It's a long strategic interest, definitely for sure for EU, because I mean, in the end, it's about jobs, right? Security and jobs and economy, and how do we all survive? I guess that's sort of the ultimate goal. So it is of interest, but it cannot be left to companies on their own to decide. So this is where I think legislation and regulation and subsidies in all kinds of sectors, and so you have to have both the carrot and the stick, which I think EU is starting to look into now with the Industrial Accelerator Act. They're trying to look at how to incentivize the industry to invest more, but it's a very long game, and companies in general don't like unpredictability, right? Because nobody wants to spend billions and then suddenly the regulation change. So it's painful to be a first mover when you have a changing legislation. I mean, we have experienced it somewhat in EU for sure. So companies that take on massive investments to retool their entire capacities and to be ready for electric surge, and then things change and legislations are relaxed. That's a bit painful. So we haven't seen the full story yet. Of course, it still has to be played out. But things like this really make companies cause them to be cautious when to invest and how to invest, and can we trust these policies, and will they last? And these type of questions are very, very core for the whole industry. So, but if the politicians are sticking to their promises and not changing too much, but changing in a predictable way, I think it's definitely doable. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Attila just mentioned two main things. First thing is fulfilling policy, and second one is making sure the OEM's balance sheets are still acceptable throughout this cost premium. Um, from your perspective, does this sort of premium or like onshoring, is there any sort of benefit that's visible to the customer that they have a pull towards these, I guess, this reorienting of supply chain, or is this largely unconsidered for customers?
Yeah, it's a good question. A good question. I mean, I think historically there would have been a benefit, but I think a lot of the early adopters, they bought their EVs, and to some extent it's I wouldn't say it's a saturated market, but it's not as easy. And I mean, also premium and abides to the same rules as everyone else. We need volume, we need scale to have cost downs, and cost downs is enabler for more competitive products, and so I wouldn't say that premium is maybe it's somewhat better off, but not to a great extent, because it's hard to keep cell plants going at small scale and do it profitably. It's so premium. If premium is big, maybe we can fill a few lines, but still it's easier when the whole industry moves in that direction, I would say.
Will, do you see it the same way?
Yeah, I think something that Attila pointed to earlier, though, as well, that ultimately this is about jobs and is about a regional economy, and you have a bloc such as the EU whose job it is to protect that and to nurture that as well. The automotive industry is a massive part of it, and so to some extent, onshoring and domestic protectionism is about that, and it's about your domestic economy as well. Maybe that doesn't immediately look like a huge benefit to the consumer if they see the price of a BYD in China and are asking why that's not reflected as 15,000 euros in Germany. But the reality being that, like mentioned as well, the prices of those vehicles in China, that has been a very competitive race to the bottom, and sometimes it's not reflected quite so well on balance sheets there as well. Not sure whether that kind of level of competition and the way that has played out would be sustainable if you transplanted it into the European region as well. So putting all that together within the system that exists in somewhere like Europe and that exists in somewhere like North America, then you can see how this could be a necessity as well. So I think it ties in as well to the lesson learning thing, right? That you need to learn the lessons as well as you can. There's no point saying, well, we've been doing this for 120 years, therefore we have nothing to learn from China. But it's also important not to go, oh, okay, great, well, we should be aiming for rock bottom prices and to build a localized LFP supply chain, because you're not going to get the same economics out of that as you do in China right now. So it's picking and choosing, learning the right lessons, and making as much progress as possible in the region that you operate.
Absolutely. And I want to pull together two threads from your answer earlier and also Till's answer just now. You mentioned that the US is still below, pretty stagnant in terms of EV penetration, about 10%. And Attila just mentioned that early adopters in Europe have already gotten their EVs. Putting this together, I mean, technically the US is still in its early adopter phase in the S curve of adoption. Does that create more opportunity for like premium high value cars to enter the market, or are we past that point?
I personally, I think we do have to be realistic about where the US is and what it's going to work in that market over the next few years. You kicked it off with talking about bit of an EV winter. I think it's appropriate appropriate way to kind of talk about the US market at the moment. You've seen the level of pullback and the tone down in messaging from particularly kind of the Detroit OEMs as well. And that's going to be the case for the next 3 or 4 years at least. There's no point pretending that this timeline can be much faster than model year 2030, 2031 at the very earliest. So it's important, that's important context. And yeah, we're still below 10% penetration in the US, including plug-in hybrids in that as well. Yeah, I think for context, we haven't had, off the top of my head, I guess we haven't had markets, the major markets that we would talk about like that below 10%, like 2013 or something as well. So this does skew towards early adopter, and early adopter often skews wealthier as well. So does that potentially create a bit of an opportunity for premium EVs? What's going to drive growth there among people who are early adopters? Maybe they're most interested in the most cutting edge technology. There's obviously a lot going on in the autonomous space in the US, be it with Tesla, be it with Rivian and Lucid have both made deals with Uber around autonomous driving as well. I think that will be a feature of what brings customers into those OEMs in particular. And while there will, I'm sure that will be paired with messaging around coming down in price and coming towards affordability. But the reality is, like, where people like Rivian and Lucid are right now, coming down in price towards affordability is still it's not going to be sub 30k for the majority of those vehicles, if any. So I think, in wider context, that does keep them in a relative premium space. It might not be ultra luxury anymore, but it keeps it in premium. I think, the next stage of development, and I'm starting to talk in a few years now, that's when we will start to probably see a bit of reinvention from the more major OEMs. You know that there's programs under the surface in Ford and in GM looking to do this. And so having the narrative move in that way a little bit over the next couple of years, ready for a bit of reinvention when the time comes, could play favorably. But it's going to look out of step, I think, for the next couple of years.
Absolutely. I feel like we could talk about this topic for eternity. Unfortunately, we're near the end of our time. This is already a very engaging conversation. I want to have a very quick concluding question for both you, Will, and Attila, before we open up the questions from the audience. Attila, maybe we can start with you first, since we just had an answer from Will. 3 years from now, what will separate the companies that successfully grew during this period of the EV winter, as we mentioned, from those that lost momentum?
I would say flexibility, speed, and efficiency are quite key. It's a volatile environment. The markets behave very differently. So being flexible, listening to what's really going on in the markets, and developing products that cater for the current needs or the specific needs could be ways to overcome that. And I think, talking about the US, as Will was talking about earlier, I think long range PHEVs, we're talking extra long range PHEVs, could be products that would fit that type of market more easily than potentially pure EVs. So especially now with the oil disturbances and what that might also ripple into the US supply, it could be a way to, let's say, stimulate the EV growth from bridging products, or that potentially also better suited for the America ecosystem in the current situation. So but it's flexibility, being able to adapt, being quick, not being too rigid. I think that those are I would say, the key things for anyone in the industry.
To be pragmatic. Yeah, I completely agree. Will?
I think from my side, it brings to mind like the analogy of like a duck on water, where it should be looking all smooth above the waterline and underneath the feet are paddling away. I think the flexibility and the capability abilities that Attila is describing. Keep everything looking appropriate above water and making progress where you can, and responding to customers' needs always. But then under the water as well, keeping that investment and that R&D in place so that when people come out the other side of the EV winter in 2, 3, 4 years time, you haven't found yourself kind of stood still in 2025 while everybody else has moved forward to 2030.
Absolutely. And with that, we'll conclude the prepared questions. Will, Attila, thank you so much for your responses. It was always a very fun conversation with you both. We're going to have a couple of minutes, maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand using the Zoom app, and then we'll call on folks for Q&A. Maybe time for 1 or 2 questions. Okay, we have Rohan with the first question. Rohan, please.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for a nice discussion. Quick question. Once we come out of this EV winter in the automotive market, how fast or how do you think the automotive companies can react or the cell manufacturers can react in terms of investment? Because now they have already scaled back a lot of their plans, and how do you think they're going to bounce back? Do you think that that's going to be an easy process, or it's going to be challenging?
Should I go first?
I'll do a quick bit, and then you go, Attila. I think what I think of in relation to that is when the Biden administration kind of implemented the IRA and made positive signals in the battery space, back in 2021, 2022, the pace of change that we saw in the pipeline of capacity and battery manufacturing in the US was remarkable. It shifted very quickly to kind of rapidly overtake the European pipeline, and a lot of that has come to fruition. It's now being transitioned. A lot of it maybe switches to energy storage. Maybe some of it doesn't come online as in the timelines that it planned, and not much of it, as was planned, is going to go into EVs in that same timeline. But that has happened, and it has shown the ability to kind of turn on the light switch for scaling, I suppose. So if you come out the other side of an EV winter and you get those positive signals again, not only have they shown that they can sort of do it before, but you've also now put yourselves in a much better position with continued R&D, vehicle platforms that exist, understanding more about how to sell EVs and what customers want from EVs, that when you do that scaling again, you can put it to better use than you did last time. That's my kind of hope for it.
I agree. I think Will is onto something there. I mean, for sure. I mean, the past investments and efforts are not forgotten, and they are not totally closed down. They are paused or reshaped, or sometimes it's multi-platform, depending on OEM, etc. But as Will is saying, the continuous R&D needs to go on, and I think companies will. The creativity will decide how this will play out. I know we are working on other elements, not just battery cells, and there's been a lot of talk about cells in general, but we're also working on like power electronics side. How can we improve that? How can we reduce costs, simplify, take out power electronics from a vehicle, because that's also a considerable chunk of money and complexity. So definitely, I think the OEMs will find a way. Especially the legacy OEMs, I could say. For the new entrants, I think time will have to tell how many will survive, because there will be some casualties for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. We have time for one more 30-second question. JR, I saw your hand up second, please.
Thank you so much. This is a lovely talk. I appreciate all of your honest input. Do you think environmental tariffs based on environmental pollution would help level the global cost of manufacturing?
It's definitely a tool. I think it should definitely be used. and I think it is used also, and more effort is being put into this. Also, especially in Europe, I would say. I think the balance here that needs to be found is how to what extent, because all of this will have some kind of implication on price and potentially EV transition. So how to balance that act to I think that's where the challenge is, but definitely a good tool. I think so, for sure. Especially for as I said, Europe. I know Europe is very keen on and very mindful of these aspects. So definitely important.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think especially that. I mean, it's the overall goal of transition, right? Is to mitigate climate change. So bringing in kind of broader sweeping environmental restrictions across manufacturing, across everything, could well be a tool that is looked to in the future. I think in the near term, you do sometimes have to be careful of like perfect being the enemy of the good. There's a long way to go yet, and there's many more kind of incremental gains that can be done first before you necessarily. Yeah, you have to be careful with big sweeping legislation like that to not shoot yourself in the foot sometimes.
Absolutely. And with that, everyone, please give a round of applause for Will Roberts and Attila Filecki for this wonderful panel conversation.